Thank you, John. I hope it's clear and loud through the microphone. Welcome, everybody. I wanted to thank, first of all, Alex and Burshu for having accepted to be the discussant and be with us here today on a Friday, just before a long bank holiday weekend. So thank you very much, and for you to be here. And also to John for chairing this meeting today. The way I thought to use the time for today's presentation is to highlight three elements that are key for the research and the products that we have developed as part of this action research we conducted with CDA and the Listening Project team based in Boston. First, I would like to reflect on what is different about this action research we have conducted with them. What are the features that makes this piece of work and this piece of research rather unique? And we are very proud of what was reflected then in the guidance that you have received today. Secondly, I would want to clarify what do we mean by feedback mechanism? And what do we mean by an effective feedback mechanism in a humanitarian context? Because this was part of what was needed in terms of clarifying the definition and the concept that relates to feedback mechanism and effectiveness of feedback handling approaches in humanitarian context. Finally, in my presentation, I decided to highlight and pick 5 key findings that emerged from our work. And these are 5 features that have been identified as being critical to make feedback loops work effectively in humanitarian context. And then we can explore more in the Q&A session each of the findings and perhaps go back to some of the country case study that we conducted. So this is the plan of what I thought to do today. And let me start by just refreshing why we did the research and what was the overarching question. We wanted to explore what makes feedback mechanism work, and we wanted to do in a way that could then allow us to generate an evidence-informed guidance that was as much as possible clear and comprehensive and based on a methodology that was transparent, traceable, and replicable by other research team who may want also to go back and trace the steps that we have taken in the research. And this was quite important for us because it's also a way to make sure that the evidence we produced is transparent and other teams may actually go back and expand perhaps the evidence base that we can create around topics such as feedback mechanism, which until very recently received quite marginal attention compared to the attention that have been given to other topics such as complaints mechanism. So this is why we place a lot of emphasis there. And let me tell you how we started our research and to delve into the topic about 2 years ago. The first choice was for us very natural, being ALNAP, Secretariat of a global network. We went to our network members and we asked them whether they wanted to host us and allow us access and open the door, so to say, to their programs in the field so that we could document in real time how the feedback works, how feedback collection, feedback handling, and response is working in different organizations and different contexts. So we did this in Sudan, in South Darfur, thanks to World Vision. And here in the room, we have Madara from World Vision, who was kind enough to put us in contact with the team in Sudan, who welcomed us last year for a field visit. We did this in IOM with a shelter cluster and IOM in Pakistan. And most recently, we did it in IFRC, with IFRC in Haiti. So these were our main case study. So what is different about this research now that you know how we went about it and how we engage with the network? Some of the points were already mentioned by John. 2 features stand out. The first one is that for us was very important to address the topic from the point of view of the users of the mechanism. And very importantly for us, we wanted to make sure that aid recipients, aid and program participants were at the center of our data collection efforts in the field. So if you allow me, we were actually asking feedback to the feedback users because we wanted to make sure that their voice was also incorporated into what went then in the guidance report. And so that was very important. Equally important was, of course, to listen to agency staff who work on feedback handling on a day-to-day basis. The second feature, why we think that this is quite a unique piece of guidance, is because compared to what has been the literature produced so far on the topic, for the first time we really wanted to make sure that not only feedback collection was at the center of our research design and methodology, but especially, as John has mentioned, feedback use. A lot of attention has been going to designing mechanism that I see people nodding in the room, which is great. I think it resonates with some, with many agencies. A lot of attention has gone to design mechanism to collect information, collect data, and being in touch with aid recipients and program participants. However, this has often gone to the detriment of focusing also on how this information is then used to bring about day-to-day program adjustment, mid-course correction into how program run on a day-to-day basis. So this is programmatic feedback for day-to-day program adjustment. This was the bulk of the focus of our report. So we thought it was nice to start just by highlighting what are the two key features that really guided us throughout the process of gathering data, conducting the field case study, and coming back to you with this guidance. You will have to allow at this point of the presentation just one slide where I do have a little bit of a definition. And we thought it was quite important to have a moment where we could clarify what do we mean by feedback mechanism and how do we describe what an effective mechanism is in humanitarian context. And so the a closed loop, as it is presented in the slide at the moment, this is a quite intuitive way of describing something that is closed because it is responded to feedback that is not only gathered but also acknowledged, analyzed, and some form of response is going back to the community. We thought that this is the minimum acceptable level that we could describe, that we could associate with a closed feedback loop. And in terms of clarifying what a feedback mechanism does, in the broadest sense, feedback mechanisms are part, most of the time, of monitoring mechanism, because they are often established as formal tool or process of some sort that are put in place to allow aid recipients, and in some cases other affected population, to get in touch with the agency, to share comment, experience, or opinion about the agency, or else, quite importantly, of other parts of the humanitarian or of the broader aid system, so not necessarily only on what the agency is doing. So this is broadly what a feedback mechanism does, which is quite different from what complaints mechanisms do, because they are very often designed to respond and cater to a type of information that is often relating to abuse and allegation, for instance, of sexual exploitation and abuse, or embezzlement, malfeasance, staff misbehavior. And so complaints mechanisms are often designed with a different referral path in mind, as well as the data verification is more stringent. So we thought to clarify that clarifying this was quite important for our research. I think now that we moved on from the definition, I thought to start by sharing 5 of the key findings that perhaps are going to provide some interesting ground for a conversation later on when we open the floor. These findings are really in our mind what should attract the bulk of attention of those agencies and practitioners and program managers, being at headquarter position or at country level, who are deciding to either formalize an existing feedback mechanism or design a brand new one. And the first one to start is that to emphasize in terms of our findings, it's really that formal is not always better. There has been a tendency to projectize. This is how some agencies discuss what they've done with the feedback mechanism, and sometimes even with accountability, with broader accountability mechanism. Projectizing those type of mechanisms has often been a vehicle that agencies have used in order to attract funding, for instance, in order to house this mechanism in a way that the organization could provide technical skills and capacities dedicated for that function. However, what we found found out is that not necessarily formalizing a feedback mechanism with a dedicated team or creating a specialist unit and having this specialism that comes with a job description that is specifically targeting feedback mechanism, feedback handling. Not often this is really conducive, because if you are operating in a context where your design, consultation, monitoring, and implementation of a program or service delivery of intervention, if you are doing this in a way that is already participatory enough, so to say, in a meaningful way of participatory, this is what I mean, then you may not need a formal mechanism, because participatory monitoring mechanism may be able to generate the information that you need to bring about this mid-course correction and adjustment you want to see in your program in order for it to remain relevant and effective and performing effectively. So yes, formal is not always better. However, regardless of how agencies decide to go about a feedback mechanism, regardless whether they decided to strengthen participatory approaches in their program design and monitoring and delivery, or regardless, they maybe decide to establish a formal mechanism, what we heard consistently across the context is that there is no surrogate for face-to-face interaction. Formal mechanisms may have the tendency of establishing more high-tech communication tool. We have seen a peak in the use and exploration of communication and two-way communication with affected population, relying on SMS-based feedback. In Haiti, we could see IFRC experimenting with a lot of beneficiary communication tool based on radio and integrated voice response tools. However, regardless of the technology, there is no replacement for in-person interaction, and this is something that across the context came very clear, was clearly brought to our attention. The next finding is, it will not come as a surprise, and it is about resource implication. So the moment an agency is deciding to formalize or strengthen their approach to complaints handling, the resource question is going to be one that very, very soon will need to be tackled. And our angle, the angle that we want to bring in this conversation, is that there are hidden costs that agency should not underestimate and overlook. And unfortunately, this is often the case. When you are at the design stage or planning to embark in a process of strengthening your feedback processes, the hidden costs I'm talking about are costs related to data entry, supporting the sorting, verification, and analysis of these very atomistic and fragmented pieces of information that different communication channels are gonna bring you to. And so this is definitely an area that has received less attention compared to data collection, often because it happens within the agency, and very often there is little support done to field staff who is tasked to collect and do the first data entry and data cleaning, if you will. And this is quite important, because this is what allows feedback data to become usable and to be looked at by program managers and decision makers against other sources of evidence, perhaps more quantitative, perhaps coming from other sort of monitoring tool. So this is quite critical and quite often underestimated. This is again another findings that you will see. It's not surprising, but we want to bring a different angle. Response is key. Responding to feedback, even if you are not able to meet all the requests of additional aid that perhaps could come through this mechanism, providing a response or clarifying why or why not you can or cannot do something, this is part of gaining acceptance, trust, and making feedback mechanisms being appreciated by the population as a sort of communication channel for them to perceive that there is less distance with the agency than what often is the case, considering that in some contexts the feedback mechanism can also function in remote monitoring and programming settings. So response is key, but it must be linked to the flexibility of making some changes to the program. The point I want to make is very clear here. I think it goes against the purpose of establishing a feedback mechanism to have one in place if you know you have no margins to make any change to the program after it has started. This is a big finding, because you risk to raise expectation that something will be done with those feedback and comments you received. But if you don't have flexibility of changing anything, because the package you are providing or the pipeline you are operating when you are delivering goods and service is airtight, there is no margin to change anything, then it really goes against the purpose of establishing such a system, and it could be quite detrimental, actually. This point, it is actually related often to where feedback mechanisms sit in an organization. So you may have a situation where at a capital office, you have a decision maker or a senior program manager in the organization who could have the leverage and could have the authority of making some changes, but he is not responsible to collate, compile, and access feedback data. So there is often a disconnect and the bottlenecks in the organization. And this is something that can only be solved not through technology for outside communication. This is something that talks to internally how communication flow in the organization and how decisions are taken. This brings me to my last point. I thought to conclude the presentation emphasizing that our research was working mainly to uncover what are the features that makes feedback mechanisms for day-to-day program adjustment and improvement. What makes this mechanism work? However, what about unsolicited feedback? It is relatively easy to collect, analyze, and take action on feedback that relates to your mandate, to what you are already doing, to your area of expertise in the context where you are with the funding that you have received. But what about whether through your feedback mechanism, and this is often the case of open-end responses, it's rarely come in a survey, but when you have this face-to-face interaction or more open-ended type of conversation with the community and through your local partner, implementing partner, for instance, what about if you receive mechanism that really doesn't have a place in what you are doing and what you are delivering at that moment in time with that community in that context? Very often, this is feedback that is either neglected or overlooked. It is quite hard to aggregate. It's often discursive in open-ended format. It's hard to analyze and verify. However, what we realize by looking at some concrete example in the field is that the most effective feedback mechanisms we observe are those who start by strengthening the practices of day-to-day programmatic feedback, but also pay attention to the unsolicited or big picture feedback, as we call it. This is feedback that touch on the strategy, on the relevance of aid, of a certain strategy or service that is delivered. The example here would be livelihood support versus food assistance in Darfur. What is needed, and the feedback that you often hear is about trying to push towards getting more livelihood support as opposed to different type of assistance. And the best mechanism are those that use and try to use, the best organization we have seen doing this, they try to collect this feedback and use it for a different purpose, very often advocacy, with other aid actors, with local authorities, with the humanitarian country team, lobbying for a different type of strategy to be negotiated. Could be land reform in Pakistan, which is something that IOM came up with and picked in their response. It is out of their mandate, but they wanted to document and make sure it was heard by those who could do something with it. And so this is an area where there is still a research gap. There is not a lot of guidance available, and the incentives are often not there to take action on this feedback. But we thought it was a good point to perhaps end the presentation and perhaps take in the question and answer and explore further any of this point. So thank you very much.
Francesca, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Francesca. I don't know about you, but I found that presentation really clear. It made very, very good sense, and it was very practical. And I can assure you that a lot of work has been condensed into that presentation. So thank you, Francesca. In fact, this business about the distinction that you make between the informal and the formal made me remember something from a very long time ago, nearly 30 years ago. I was working in Sudan, actually, in a place called the Red Sea Hills, where Oxfam were running a destocking, restocking program, and the Beja people, who are a pastoralist group up there, were receiving food aid. And I remember there used to be a thing in those days, this is 1986, 1987, called the shake desk. And a shake desk was basically the head of the community, the sheikh, a very fine-looking man, I seem to remember, in a white jalabiya and a white turban, sitting behind a desk. And literally anyone that wanted to complain about Oxfam or give them a sort of advice or maybe even praise them, I'm not sure, would go to the sheikh and they'd sort it out internally. I suppose that's a good example of it. It still exists?
In some form in South Darfur, yeah.
Good heavens. Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So I thought it was very good, but we're going to check to see everyone's got their own opinions.